So I recently completed The Last Kingdom Season 4 and it was really good. In my opinion, probably the best season since the first one. This season covers quite a bit of ground both plot-wise and historically. It covers the beginning of Canute the Great's path to kingship, the Battle of Tettenhall, Sigtryggr of Ireland, and the political tensions between Mercia, Wessex, Wales, and the Norse kings. I want to touch upon some of the history in the series that only gets alluded to a little bit, or maybe has a few pieces of dialogue dedicated to it at most. I won't go over the history already covered in the series, but some of the things it either foreshadows or simply makes mention of. Now, one of the first things that happens in The Last Kingdom Season 4 is the Scottish attacks on Bebbanburg. This is one raid in the show that never happens again, but it tells us a lot. When you consider Bebbanburg's real-life historical position in northern England, it is feasible for that place to be a raiding target. Scottish kingdoms and Pictish groups, and yes, those were two different kinds of people, were a factor during the Viking Age, though the Pictish culture in particular was basically completely assimilated out by the 1000s. Also keep in mind that this small, unassuming raid seems to be foreshadowing of further historical events. The real-life Bebbanburg, or Bambra, was the site of a great battle between England and a coalition of Irish and Scottish kings in 937. The English, under Athelstan, won the fight, and thus England was considered truly united for the first time. Athelstan was also the first monarch to consider himself King of the English. So there is a precedent for a group of Scots to be invading Bebbanburg. This place will become important later on in the history of the British Isles and Ireland. The next factor I want to discuss is the role of Wales in the story and what that means in real history. Now, the Celts, or the Gaels, or the Britons, basically the native people of what is now the UK and Ireland, were and are a people with thousands of years of history in England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. What is relevant to us is that by the time they encountered the Anglo-Saxons, they were more Romanized and urbanized into more organized nations, recognizable to the known world of their time. Wales represents the spirit of that old Britain, and in The Last Kingdom, their animosity shows. They're reluctant to help against the Vikings, and even discuss erecting a wall between them and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. You may wonder why Wales and the Saxon kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia didn't coordinate more to stem the expansion of Norse kings and warlords, especially since they were all Christian and shared a common enemy. But if you look at it from a Welsh point of view, the Saxons and the Vikings were not really all that different. In the first place, the Anglo-Saxons were a group of northern Europeans who were supposedly invited into England to help fight the northern Picts when the Romans departed to deal with issues on the continent, but to never return. Long story short, those Anglo-Saxons stayed, and continuous migration, settlement, and warfare persisted from the 400s all the way until the Vikings arrived in approximately 793 CE. During this time, Britons were continually forced west and northwards in England by various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Wales essentially became a place of refuge for native Britons. When Norsemen came to stake their claims in the British Isles and Ireland later on, you can imagine it was probably seen as more of a continuation of something the Anglo-Saxons started, albeit this time much more pagan in nature. This at least united the Welsh and Saxons one time, but it was not the Battle of Tettenhall in 910 that was portrayed in The Last Kingdom, but in 893 at the Battle of Buddington, as a joint Welsh-Saxon force defeated a Norse army and forced them off the island. But the fact that there are so few examples of the Saxons and the Welsh fighting together against the Vikings speaks to the animosity and bad blood that existed between the two peoples, and thus it's not too outlandish that the Welsh really had no love for Wessex and Mercia in The Last Kingdom. Finally, I want to talk about the allusions made to Ireland in The Last Kingdom Season 4. One of the primary characters in this new season was Sigtryggr, a Norse Gael Viking who was expelled from Ireland, so him and his army sought a new home and new lands in Wales and England as a result of their exile. We know this happens, but we aren't really given anything on the process of their exile. What was the context of the expulsion of Norsemen from Irish shores? It's important to understand Ireland's unique interactions with Norwegian and Danish raiders and settlers. Ireland was a raiding target in the early days of the Viking era, just like England was, but permanent settlement apparently didn't start until the reign of Thorgest the Sea King in 837. This king attacked Ireland, which was at the time divided into two major kingdoms of Tara and Munster, though smaller ones did exist. But Thorgest's Norwegian Vikings became effectively the third power in the region. He even established the city of Dublin, which would later become the capital of modern Ireland. And that's among other cities that him and the Vikings founded. Now, much like a lot of Europe, monasteries were places of great wealth, mostly unguarded. So they became easy targets, but the Norsemen soon realized that the monasteries were also seats of learning and political power. So much so that it was possible for religious organizations and monasteries to even do battle with each other. The Norse groups sought to control these monasteries by either capturing their leadership or settling around such monasteries and assimilating into Irish life. But conversely, many Irish took to the Norse way of life after they were established there, to make a fortune and to get by in their new reality. Danes later joined the Irish and the Norwegians on the island, initially united by Thorgest. There was a tentative peace, but now these three groups with Viking tendencies and culture were now living simultaneously within Ireland, and a volatile situation was just waiting to explode. Once Thorgest was captured and killed by the Kingdom of Tara, all unity disintegrated. Ethnic violence spilled into the towns and villages of Ireland, and a few years after Thorgest's death in approximately 844, Viking territories consisted only of eastern coastal towns. This is what you can consider the first expulsion, until Olaf the White of Norway and Ivar the Boneless of Denmark made peace a few years into the conflict to re-establish a Norse presence in Ireland and keep the cash flow and soldiers coming. So Norse settlements and fighting forces remained in Ireland, and Ireland was even a springboard for Viking invasions of England and Scotland. But Norsemen never had a unifier like Thorgest again. There was a second expulsion of Vikings in 902 in which the real Sigtryggr, better known as Sihtric, was involved. Sigtryggr would return and wreak havoc on eastern Ireland, even participating in a battle in which 6 Irish kings were killed in 919. So he returned some prestige to the Norse armies in Ireland, but it only lasted until 980, when Norse king Olaf the Red was defeated by an Irish king, therefore making the Norsemen only a bit player in Irish affairs. The last of the Norse armies were driven from Ireland around 1014, but the cultural mixing of the island had left a permanent mark on Ireland, which was now part Gaelic, part Norwegian, and part Danish. The Norse experiment in Ireland was only partly successful. They did create a presence there, but due to a lack of unity among Norse groups, cultural mixing and assimilation, and Irish natives playing the Vikings game, Norse kingdoms never really got going in the same way they did England and Scotland. Also keep in mind, despite divisions into countless states, the military organization and martial culture of these Irish groups, forged by hundreds of years of infighting, made Ireland extremely hard to subdue. Even the Normans who conquered England so handily in the 1060s failed to take the entirety of Ireland, and the island was not totally conquered by a foreign power until King Henry VIII of England finally did so in the 1500s. It's also worth noting that back when the Romans were around in England, there was mention of a possible invasion into Ireland, but it's possible that Ireland was split into so many smaller warring groups. It's worth noting that even the Romans didn't bother conquering Ireland. Now, there are a few theorized reasons why. One is that maybe they just weren't interested because there weren't any resources, and another is that it was too disunited. There were so many different warring factions in Ireland during that time, they thought it wasn't even worth it to go and commit their forces in there. So if the latter reason is to be believed, that really does give us a precedent for why so many different foreign forces throughout history have had so much trouble keeping Ireland in line. I can imagine the addition of Norse culture and military tradition to the island's retinue of cultures made it even harder for subsequent rulers to try and defeat Ireland. Even when England finally took control in the 1500s, there were constant rebellions and uprisings throughout the centuries. And we also had an entire arc in The Last Kingdom Season 4 based around a sickness which was ravaging Mercia. Now, there is no record of any plague around the time this season is taking place, which is around 910 or so, but Finan talked about seeing sickness affect many people he knew, but it's hard to get at what he was talking about, since the last major sickness in Ireland at this point happened all the way in the 600s CE, so there was no way Finan was around for that unless he's actually a vampire or something. The next one to happen would be the well-known Black Plague of the 1340s, which hit Ireland as well. That was mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in 896 CE. Now, we only get anecdotes about this plague hitting England, but considering the geographical proximity, it isn't super outlandish to think Ireland might have been hit to a degree, especially with so much more contact being facilitated through Viking warfare and trade. Finan seems to be of similar age to Uhtred, so it's reasonable to believe he was in Ireland at the time of this plague. So this is the only thing I can think of when it comes to a sickness he has personal experience with. Well, that was my brief video on some of The Last Kingdom Season 4's other history. My social media is in the description. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.